So we give the speaker enough time. Thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Eric Chu, and I'm on the faculty here at UC Davis in the Department of Human Ecology, and I just so happen to also be one of the co-directors of the UC Davis Climate Adaptation Research Center. This morning, as part of our long-standing webinar series, we have the honor and privilege of welcoming Madeline Drake at the California Natural Resources Agency. Just a quick note, we had, well, I'll let maybe Madeline talk more about this, but we invited Dr. Jennifer Norris to come, but she was called in for a budget meeting last minute. And so we're eternally grateful and super happy and privileged that Madeline has agreed to step in quite last minute. This happened yesterday. And so we're excited to have Madeline. But before we jump into the session itself, a couple notes about how we're going to run this session this morning. Everyone who's attending is currently muted. And so I ask that you maybe keep the mute button on. If you have questions or issues, please type those into the chat box. Sophia Depew, who is our wonderful undergraduate research assistant, is on hand to tackle any technical issues that you may be facing. And so if you type those issues into the chat box, Sophia will be monitoring that. If you have questions or comments about the presentation, the content of the presentation, please also type those in the chat box. What I'll do is I'll hold those until the very end. We have a couple minutes at the very end for conversation. And so I'll bring those up. I'll just collect those during the presentation itself and bring those up at the very end. And if you have questions that you want to verbalize, just hold on to those and we'll come back to those at the very end. The meeting is being recorded and the recording will be posted on YouTube at the very end after the event. And we typically have very good number of views on those. And so that's really nice. Next slide, please, Sophia. So I have the privilege of introducing Madeline Drake. Madeline Drake is the Assistant Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency, where she advises and coordinates with the CNRA departments, boards, and conservancies to implement California's 30 by 30 strategy. Before Natural Resources Agency, Madeline was the Biodiversity Coordinator for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And she also led the team that developed California's Pathways to 30 by 30 document, the strategic framework for conserving 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030. I hope Madeline doesn't mind me mentioning this, but Madeline is also a UC Davis alum. And so welcome back. It's great to have you. And so at this point, I'll maybe turn it over to Madeline and take it away.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Eric. And let me share my screen real quick. All right. Can you see that okay, Eric? Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here today and talk with you all. Especially as Eric mentioned, I was a UC Davis alum, and that's actually what brought me out to California, and I will talk about that today. So we're focusing on biodiversity and habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency in our little team, but I do know that this is sort of a climate adaptation resilience webinar. So, biodiversity and climate go hand in hand. And so I hope that will be clear from today's talk. I'm sure you all know as well, but I'm happy to talk more about what we're doing at the California Natural Resources Agency. All right. So as I mentioned, I moved out to California to go to UC Davis for graduate school. I was in the animal biology program. But once I came out here, I just fell in love with California. As somebody who loves to be outside, it feels like there's endless opportunities to scuba dive and surf and go to the mountains and ski and hike and camp and, family, dogs, all of the above. It's just a great place and I love being here. But when I see headlines, things like humans are speeding extinction and altering the natural world at an unprecedented rate, or humans have pushed climate into unprecedented territory. Climate change could displace 200 million people by 2050, or biodiversity crisis affects billions who rely on wild species. My heart just breaks. Selfishly, I don't want to lose out on the opportunities and things that I love to do when I go out and enjoy nature. But more importantly, I know, and I'm pretty sure you all do too if you're here, that nature is critical to human and health well-being. So we rely on nature for our food, our medicines, our housing, our clothing, even the air we breathe. We need healthy ecosystems to survive. So what can we do when we see these depressing news headlines? Well, scientists from across the world have come together to say that if we can conserve 30% of lands and waters by 2030, then we might have a fighting chance against the biodiversity and climate crises. And there's a growing body of literature to help back up these numbers. It is a bit of a call to action and a goal, a global goal, but it is based in science. And there have now been almost 200 countries that have committed to conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030, including the US as a whole, as part of the America the Beautiful initiative. But California, being such a huge state, we're on track to be the fifth. I think we're now fifth, on track to be the fourth largest economy in the world. We wanted to be a part of the solution as well. So in October of 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Executive Order N8220. So broadly, this executive order expands nature-based solutions to achieve California's climate and biodiversity goals. And I think I saw that one of your last talks was actually on nature-based solutions. So I hope some of you are familiar with that or can go back and watch that recording. But importantly for our team, this executive order committed the state to conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. So that is a big focus of our team that came out of this executive order. And this executive order called for us to write a strategy for how we are going to achieve that goal. So after the executive order came out, we knew that this was a really broad strategy. The state of California has, I think, like 101 million acres, plus our coastal waters. So we knew this couldn't be done in a silo, that we had to have partners from all over the state with all different types of expertise come and help us achieve this goal. So as Eric already mentioned, I led the team that wrote the strategy document, but before we ever put pens and paper, it was important to us to do sort of an extensive public input sort of gathering so that we had an idea of what were going to be the best solutions to help us get to our 30 by 30 goal. So in the spring and summer of 2021 is when we sort of kicked off this sort of public input initial rounds. And during this initial rounds, we had a lot of different tribal consultations and listening sessions to really understand how tribes would like to be involved in 30 by 30. We held 9 regional workshops across the state. So this sort of colorful map on my screen shows how the state was broken down. In this venue, we sort of did these like short Twitter answers where people could respond in sort of quick it's like text answers live on the screen. And so through all that, we got like 10,000 responses from about 2,500 participants during these regional workshops. And then during that same time, we had an online survey. So the people could provide longer answers. They could submit data sets. They could write us letters. And the map on the bottom portion of the screen shows sort of where the respondents were throughout the state. And then we still had some key questions centered around sort of key topics that we wanted to address in our document. So we held 5 topical advisory panels during the summer of 2021, and that included a panel on climate, on equity, on biodiversity, on conservation of lands, and on conservation of coastal waters. And for each of these panels, we brought together about 8 to 10 experts from across the state who came and answered key questions that we really needed help addressing before we sort of put pens to paper for our strategy document. But for these topical panels, California is a huge state, and we know that there's experts across the state, and 8 to 10 people isn't going to really cut it and get sort of the breadth of knowledge that we have in our state. So we not only gave a set of questions to our experts who wrote us a white paper, but we also released these questions to the public and then held a public meeting where anybody could come and provide the feedback to the questions that we asked our experts as well. Important questions that we asked when we requested input is things like important places, species, and habitats, locally as well as statewide. What are the challenges and opportunities for conservation? What are the challenges and opportunities for advancing equity through 30 by 30? One of the most difficult questions that we grappled with was, how do we define conservation by 30 by 30? It's actually difficult to say, how are we going to count this and what should and shouldn't count? And then I think my favorite question, my team's favorite question, was, what does success look like once we get to 2030? 30 by 30 is a numbers game, but we are thinking much broader than that. And so, this question really helped us grapple with, what would the world look like once we got there if we were actually successful? And what would 30 by 30 mean more than just getting to that number? So, put pens to paper from all this feedback that we received. And in the fall of 2021, we released our draft document again, so that we could put it out to the world and get feedback. Did we accurately reflect all that we heard and all that we could do to help achieve this goal? So after the draft went out, we held more tribal consultations and listening sessions. We received over 1,000 letters on our draft, heard from about 4,000 individuals, convened an advisory committee of 12 leaders from across the state who came together in a public forum to sort of provide feedback in a public way on our document. And then finally, we held a public meeting where, again, we opened the mic to anybody who wanted to come, who didn't just want to provide or only provide written comments. They could come and they could also sort of talk to us about their feedback as well. So after all this process and all the great input that we received, we released our final Pathways to 30 by 30 document in April of 2022, actually on Earth Day. And that's what I'm going to be sort of focusing on today, is what's in it and how are we implementing it, and how does that sort of reach our broader climate and biodiversity goals as the state. So our document has 3 key objectives that we want to be thinking about when looking for opportunities for conservation in 30 by 30. That's to protect and restore our biodiversity, to expand access to nature, and to mitigate and build resilience to climate change. We also have 3 core commitments, or things that we are thinking about front of mind when we're implementing our strategy. And that includes advancing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, strengthening our tribal partnerships, and protecting our economic prosperity, clean energy resources, and food supply as a state. Definition of conservation, and we actually ended up calling it 30 by 30 conservation areas, because we actually felt like we weren't appropriate to define conservation, that we wanted to make sure that we were being very specific about, this is what we mean for conservation for 30 by 30 here in California. And the conceptual definition that we landed on was land and coastal water areas that are durably protected and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the diversity of life that they support. And that was from so much great input to really help us get to what we feel like is a solid definition for what conservation should count for 30 by 30 to really help us achieve our goals. So now that we have a definition, well, how close are we to reaching that goal? Well, we think that right now we're conserved about 24% that would count towards 30 by 30, and 16% of our coastal waters. And for those of you who might be familiar with the data sets, we use the California Protected Areas Database and the California Conservation Easement Database for our lands data. And we felt like the sort of categorization that best met our conceptual definition was GAP Codes 1 and GAP Code 2 to really sort of draw it on the map. And for our coastal waters, we work very closely with the Ocean Protection Council, who focuses sort of on this piece for the state. And they felt like that the network of 124 marine protected areas in the state best met this conceptual definition for 30 by 30. So things that are included, because 24% is a good amount of land. So that includes really a spectrum of different landscapes, and we hope that that will as we continue to move towards our goal as well. So things that are dedicated conservation places, really protected specifically for their biodiversity, recreation and open spaces that sort of let the public come in and enjoy biodiversity and nature. Our working lands, some working lands that have sort of key biodiversity protections in them, things like working forests that really focus on natural cycles. And our watershed or rangelands is another one. Our watersheds and freshwater connectivity, that is included in there. We did get a lot of questions on that, but freshwater is sort of counts under the land side. And then, as I mentioned, our network of marine protected areas. But I also want to mention that one thing that we really learned throughout this whole process is the importance of all conservation. It's really hard to define and sort of put lines on a map, and that was a difficult process for us. But we know that we can't have 70% of nature sort of paved over with concrete and then 30% of nature out there, right? So all conservation is important, whether it counts on this map or whether it really helps elevate it. It could be that it's too small to be mapped, or like a pollinator garden in my backyard, or it could be that it's not sort of durably protected, that it is sort of a great natural space now. But there's not yet the proper protections in place, or some of our working lands that can't be developed but aren't necessarily managed for biodiversity. So there is a broad spectrum of conservation out there, and we really need to support and elevate it all to meet our goals for 30 by 30, whether it counts on a map or not. So as part of our strategy, we came up with 10 pathways to help us achieve our 30 by 30 goals. So that includes accelerating regionally led conservation, recognizing that there's already so many great plans out there that just need to be implemented. And so how can we really help implement those? Or for those who need to sort of write a plan in their area, places that might be lacking that sort of strategy or strategic vision, how can we help them get there? Executing strategic land acquisition to really meet our 3 key objectives, to increase conservation easements, to enhance conservation of existing public lands and coastal waters, recognizing that not all public lands count towards our goal, and that there can be some elevated designations and conservation measures that really sort of help meet our definition and sort of advance biodiversity, climate, and access better than they already are. To institutionalize advanced mitigation, using this as a tool to really think about large-scale proactive conservation. To expand and accelerate environmental restoration and stewardship. This really recognizes that not all land that we're protecting right now is in sort of the best shape it could be. So we need to really include restoration and getting those natural processes and healthy ecosystems in place. And for those of you who might be familiar with our team's Cutting Green Tape initiative, this is our initiative to sort of help increase pace and scale of restoration that we know needs to happen, especially to sort of help meet our climate goals. And so this is where it really fits in pathway number 6, and looking for efficiencies in the permitting process and funding process to help, again, increase pace and scale of restoration. Our 7th pathway is to strengthen coordination among governments, recognizing that our state obviously plays a role, but so do our key federal partners and our local governments and our tribal partners as well. And how can we all work together to really leverage opportunities? To align investments to maximize conservation benefit, not only public funding, but also private and philanthropy funding as well. To advance and promote complementary conservation measures. And this is really recognizing that we need to elevate and really support those things that might not count, but are complementary to 30 by 30, and again, help us meet our key objectives. And then finally, to evaluate conservation outcomes and adaptively manage. And this is really looking at the idea that, we can't just conserve our land and walk away. We're not going to meet our 3 key objectives. We need to be really looking to see, is the land that we protected meeting those goals, and how can we sort of manage it so that it can meet our goals, and really sort of help us fight the biodiversity and climate crises. I also want to mention 6 appendices that really help support our pathways, in case anyone might be interested. So we have an appendice on regional insights that really takes a snapshot. A lot of the information that we heard during those local meetings were localized, and we wanted a place where we could look at sort of regional priorities. We have one on near-term actions to jumpstart 30 by 30. So as part of the 10 pathways, there's about 100 actions for us to sort of accomplish that we think needs to be accomplished to meet our goal. And this sort of outlines which ones we think need to be first. The Biodiversity Council, which is a convening of our local, state, and federal government partners, they put together an appendices called Shared Opportunities to Advance 30 by 30. And that's where they pulled together all their programs that they think will help us meet our 30 by 30 goal, to have it in one place. So you could see all this different government programs that will help contribute to 30 by 30. The Biodiversity Network, which is a group of scientists that came together, researchers, practitioners, to really help us understand the science that supports 30 by 30. And this group is open to anybody who might be interested in joining, but they put together an appendice for us that really focused on the science priorities to help inform 30 by 30. And then the Ocean Protection Council put together sort of an equivalent one, really focused on coastal waters and the science needs to help inform that piece of the puzzle. And then finally, we brought together all those existing conservation plans that our partners shared with us. We specifically asked for it, and when we released our draft, to help us find any plans that we missed, so that we can have a resource of all those plans that need to be implemented and help us sort of strategically think about conservation moving forward. At the same time we released our strategy document, we also released CA Nature, which is a suite of sort of explorer applications. And this was in partnership with Esri, Geographic Information Systems. So they really help us build these sort of state-of-the-art, how can we show people where there are opportunities to advance conservation, and help them get sort of almost fast statistics, so that when they're applying for funding or just looking for opportunities, they have the knowledge and the information available and on a map. And so I have some screenshots to kind of help show you what that means and how that works in practice. But I would encourage you all to go to our website and play with it, because they are interactive. And so you can really find, the data that, you will take to heart and that will be most meaningful for you. So this is just sort of the general look to see, it's our tracker. How are we doing? How are we doing in meeting our goal? So like I said, 101.4 acres total in California. Right now we've conserved 24.1 million acres, which is, breaking down 23.78% of California. So in this sort of explorer, you can zoom in and click on the lands if you want, but this is really our tracker. If you look at the sort of more detailed view, though, here I've narrowed it down to Yolo County, where UC Davis is, and you can see that there is 10.88% of the county preserved or conserved in that area. You can look at it by gap code and say, okay, what's in gap code 1 and what's in gap code 2, and that's if you want to go down that road of what that means, it is sort of some differences in how the area is managed. And you can read more about the data that filters into this on our website as well. And you can also look at it by management agency. Is it federal, state, local, nonprofit, and access type? Is it open or closed access to the public? And as I mentioned in this map too, you can click on a piece and you can see what is it, what is there and what data is there. If I click on this area, a long piece of data will come down that relates to the attribute table. But this particular piece you can see is the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. We also have a Biodiversity Explorer, which uses CDFW's areas of conservation emphasis data set, so that you can look for the highest biodiversity opportunities. So you can look at a ranking that a lot of data filters into. Again, I would encourage you to read kind of what filters into that data, but you can kind of quickly see sort of where the highest biodiversity rankings are, whether it's terrestrial or aquatic, connectivity, as well as climate resilience. There's also a detailed view in this particular Explorer that will show you what sort of ecosystem or habitat types are conserved in your area and where there might be opportunities to kind of go for some of those underrepresented habitats in your area. So again, Yolo County, I already mentioned, was about 10.9% total conserved. But looking at the different habitat types that are represented in Yolo County, you can notice, well, it seems like hardwood, woodland, and herbaceous areas are kind of underconserved compared to some of the other habitats in the area. You can compare that to the state, so you can see that they're sort of underconserved in the state as well. And so it could be a good opportunity to look for areas like that could be conserved in your area. You have a Climate Explorer that really lets you look at different scenarios, times, models, and what that means for climate in your particular area or the state as a whole. So you can look at maximum temperature or minimum temperature, and you can also look at average precipitation. And this is just, again, a breakdown of how different areas might or might not fare, and sort of where you're projected to see the most or the least change to climate impacts. In the same Explorer, there's another tab for sea level rise, where again you can look at different sea level rise scenarios and storm scenarios on a map to kind of see which areas might be more vulnerable. And maybe my favorite Explorer, actually, even though I'm a biologist, is the Access Explorer, because it brings together information like I haven't seen before in any Explorer that I've interacted with. And it really looks at nature and demographics so that you can find opportunities to say, where can I improve access to nature based on the demographics of my area? So for this example, I have Los Angeles County, because Los Angeles County is 26% of the total population of California. So 26% of the state's people live in Los Angeles County. And you can see that it shows, as a county as a whole, the age distribution, education, housing, occupancy, different demographics, or race and ethnicity, as well as household income. I can then filter it to sort of those gap codes 1 and 2, or what are considered conserve for 30 by 30. And you can see a very different picture of those demographics. So only 3% of the population in Los Angeles County lives within a half a mile of one of those 30 by 30 conserved areas. And if you sort of click back and forth, you can see that the age distribution increases, education increases. It like flip-flops from renter to owner. More people who own houses live closer to nature. If there's a lot of different races listed, but sort of the primary one is white, and it's a little more distributed in our total population. But if you sort of look at who's living closer to nature, you can see that it does sort of skew to more white people living closer to nature. And then finally, household income, you can see a lot of the wealthier communities are living closer to nature. So for anywhere in the state, you can kind of do a closer filter. For this one, you can even filter in for some cities where the data is available to see where there are real opportunities to increase access to nature in this area. So now that our strategy came out, these tools came out to help us envision opportunities, we're now in this implementing stage. So how can we actually meet this goal before 2030? So to really help us move forward and advance 30 by 30, we have the 30 by 30 partnership. And this was a group of anybody who wants to be a part of 30 by 30. So our government partners, our community organizations and coalitions, our regional parks, our resource conservation districts, land trusts, legislators and legislative staff, students, researchers, community scientists, private and public funders, people who love nature. And if you don't feel included on that list, but you want to be a part of 30 by 30, then that includes you as well. So we had a big kickoff event for our 30 by 30 partnership in September, and it was filled to capacity. We filled our room and sold out. So we had partners sort of come together in person to kind of hear about what's going on with our strategy. And we brought all of our state agencies and we're going to be implementing the strategy to kind of talk with our partners on where there's opportunities to work together. There's also a bubble diagram on the screen right now, and this is sort of some of the key groups that are sort of helping us lead this 30 by 30 partnership. So we have the Biodiversity Council, which is that group of federal, state, and local governments that I mentioned. Our Biodiversity Networker, which is a group of researchers that have come together to help inform 30 by 30. I know I mentioned them as well. Our tribal partners, really led by Assistant Secretary Geneva Thompson, who's focused on tribal affairs. And so she's really kind of helping us understand how to really connect our tribal partners to 30 by 30. The Ocean Protection Council, who's taking lead on the coastal waters piece. And it's sort of, since coastal waters are all public, it sort of has its own unique challenges and opportunities. And so they're really taking lead on that piece. And then our regional working groups and coalitions, there were so many that came together when we were putting together our strategy to provide input. And we really want to keep that momentum going all throughout implementation. So we really want to make sure that they're a part of sort of these key groups as we're moving forward as well. And this is all sort of hubbed on a 30 by 30 partnership coordinating committee, where we have representatives from all this group, and they're sort of coming together to say, you know, this is what we're hearing from all of our partners, and this is how we think that, you know, more information needs to get out there. You know, this topic is something that's still confusing. How can we share more information here? So that partnership coordinating committee is 18 individuals from around the state, and it will sort of change over each year. And it's sort of made up of representatives from all these different groups. So what we're really focusing on in 2023 with our strategy out is implementing it. And what does that mean? Well, in our budget this past year, there was 1.1 billion set aside for nature-based solutions. And so right now we're sort of getting a lot of that funding out the door, sort of in looking ahead. So I can sort of share with you all where there are resources about that funding. We're also, you know, helping put informational resources out there, hearing from our partners, where is there still confusion? Where do you need a deeper dive or more help? So, you know, spending time really thinking about where there are sort of confusions or misunderstandings still, and how can we help fill that gap? And then facilitating connections. You know, this is a statewide effort. We are a huge state. And so how can we do our best to bring people together who might be working on similar work or might have similar ideas, or really sort of align funding opportunities? So facilitating connections across the board. And as we're sort of moving into 2023, we do have some sort of new engagement strategies that we're sort of kicking off now that our strategy is out the door. So, you know, we're going to continue to have webinars, just as we did with public input, but to, again, really share information and advance our pathways. We're also planning a lot of local meetings and field trips so that we can get out in the field and actually see a lot of this. You know, our public input happened really in the heart of COVID still. So a lot of it was virtual, but now that it's kind of, we can get out in the world, you know, we're excited to use our virtual tools to bring together people from across the state, but we're also excited to go out and to kind of see some of these things on the land and hear more local conversations in sort of in-person meetings. We just launched a newsletter this year to kind of keep up with 30 by 30 projects and action and funding opportunities. We have a blog, so people who are implementing 30 by 30 from across the state who kind of want to write about something that they think could be useful to others to learn from. We have a space for that as well. We'll be putting out an annual report on how we're doing on our pathway strategy, what's working, what isn't, and how are we going to sort of focus on the actions moving forward. And then we are planning to have a second annual 30 by 30 partnership event in the fall. So again, bring everybody together for those key conversations and really build those connections and information sort of exchange in that sort of venue. So we do have a website. That's where our CIS or our GIS CA nature tools are. But I do want to mention some other resources that are there that are probably going to be pretty helpful if you're interested in funding opportunities or sort of key topics in our pathways document. You can find all of that on our website now. So under our resources tab, under funding opportunities, we held what we called a 30 by 30 virtual expo series, where we brought those same partners that were at our partnership event, but for those who couldn't attend, or for new information, or so that people can just go back and watch it again. We have this virtual expo series where the state agencies that received funding through our nature-based solutions sort of funding package came together and sort of said, this is how we're going to spend the money. This is where there's opportunities for people to apply. This is how you apply. And those are really short 30-minute conversations, and most of them had about 2 agencies included. So they're sort of short bits that people can kind of digest quickly and really kind of quickly see where there's funding opportunities over the next year. We also have these topical summaries for key topics that people were still confused about from our strategy. So for example, how does freshwater fit into 30 by 30? We pulled all that information into a short 2-pager. It's a little bit easier to digest than sort of reading the full strategy. And there's, other topics as well, like wildlife corridors. There's a lot of interest in those. And so how does that fit into 30 by 30? Because they are, a small piece, but they are connecting large land. So we, really think that that is a part of 30 by 30. Things like access, coastal waters, those complementary conservation measures. It's just a little bit of a deeper dive in a more sort of short, digestible format. And then what I want to sort of end on is this: what does success look like as we're thinking about implementing the strategy and where we're going? And again, this is the question that really kind of drove my team and inspired us and kept us hopeful and sort of kept our eye on the vision of what 30 by 30 means beyond just the numbers. So these are real answers that I pulled from real people that really inspired our team. Themes like cleaner waters, better air quality, more open spaces, more plants, more trees, more animal, more insects, healthy ecosystems, and healthy communities. Biodiversity losses are halted and reversed. Reversal of greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone can access green space within a 10-minute walk. Our kids have the same natural world that we have, or even better, our children live in a healthier environment than we do. So we felt very hopeful from the public's answers, and we're really hopeful as we move forward and implement the strategy that this is a rally cry and a movement to really help us sort of achieve and kind of fight and hopeful in our biodiversity and climate crises that we face. So that's why we're really working on these and are excited to move forward. So if you aren't already, I would encourage you to explore the applications that I talked about today. Again, they're interactive, so you can really kind of zoom in and look at what's important for your area. You can also read our strategy document, our appendices. You can see the different resources that I provided, and you can watch all our webinars. They're all up there, even all the public input webinars. If you wanted to go back and see the public feedback we received, it's all up there, it's all out there. And we want people to be involved and be a part of this moving forward, because we know we have about 6 million acres to go for land, and 500,000 acres, 500,000 in our coastal waters. So 24% sounds good, but we still have a ways to go. And so we hope that we will have a big partnership moving forward as we're implementing our strategy. So do go to our website at www.californianature.ca.gov. And it's a great opportunity to learn more about this and to get involved. There's even sort of a contact us page. And you can also reach out to our team at californianature@resources.ca.gov. And that's where you can kind of ask questions or, let us know about events that you think are important. Again, we're trying to get out and talk with partners more. So do reach out to us. We want to hear from you. And we hope that this is something that continue to be a two-way conversation as we're moving forward and implementing our strategy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madeline. That was wonderful. maybe we can give a couple minutes for folks to collecting some questions. Please either unmute yourself, or raise your hand, unmute yourself, or type them into the chat box. And as we're doing that, I always, maybe I'll take the opportunity to maybe start off the conversation. My conversation is about the process that you experienced while putting together 30 by 30. What were some of the major conflicts, contestation points that you encountered? Maybe just a handful, just to give us a sense of sort of what were the challenges and what was done to overcome them, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I feel like there, are a lot of different flavors of challenges and a variety across the board. So one that I feel like is, in the news even is people who are concerned that 30 by 30 is a land grab from the government. And so, it's us being very clear that this is actually voluntary. We're not forcing anybody into conservation. We're trying to provide incentives and funding and, ways to get it done, but we can't force anybody into conservation. So making it clear that, we're not going to come steal your land for this initiative or anything like that. But we want to work with people who are willing to work with us as a part of this initiative. And that's a big one that you'll hear from the Federal America the Beautiful initiative too, sort of thinking about this across the whole country. Others we heard were, how are we making sure, this is a statewide strategy, how are we making sure local priorities are included, and that we aren't going, that we're actually serious and meaningful about advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, because conservation has not been done in a way like that in the past always, that is sort of representative of the community and something they want, and has even caused harm in the past. So how can we make sure that there are things in place and that we're sort of thinking, even though we are sort of a statewide entity, at a local level for local priorities, and sort of making sure the checks are in place that we don't do any further harm. So that's another thing that we sort of grappled with, was, how can we be meaningful about this and serious about this, and not just give it lip service? So we've got a lot of great input. We really tried to sort of highlight local themes and priorities in our strategy. And that's one reason why we're really sort of trying to prioritize local meetings right now too. So I think, feedback from across the board, there were a lot of issues. How do you define conservation? Probably was, one of the all over the board, right? Are we being too strict? Are we being too open? And how do we find that sort of sweet spot in being meaningful? So, definitely, issues to overcome, but a lot of it was in the spirit, I will say, of really making us think and do better.
Thanks. There's a question that's come in the chat box from Clancy DeSmet. Is there a reason for why the 30 by 30 Climate Explorer doesn't have sea level rise information north of Point Nervina?
Great question. And I'm not actually sure, but I could look into it. It could be that I know the data sets they used were from the 4th climate assessment. So as sort of the 5th climate assessment comes up, I hope that I know that they will be updating it as well, but it could be tied to why they didn't there as well, but I'd have to look into it because I'm not sure. But that's a great question. I should look into that.
Yeah. And just clarification, all the portals, all the resources are available on californianature.ca.gov.
Yes, they are. So all of our sort of Explore applications that I previewed, and all the data is there too. So if you wanted to download our data and use it for your own purposes, you could. And for those who are a little more advanced in GIS, we have something called the Explore application or opportunities modeler. And so that lets you bring in your own data with our data and sort of in an online format if you don't have GIS yourself. So it's all out there. It's all open source. Depending on your level of familiarity, hopefully there's something for you. But we want it to be a place where people can quickly find answers that they might be wondering.
Any more questions from the floor? Please raise your hand, unmute yourself. Or I can keep going. I don't want to take over the conversation. Maybe give it a couple more seconds in case folks have something. All right, so maybe I'll take the opportunity to ask a second question. So Madeline, you mentioned that 2023 is the year of implementation now, and assuming that the 1.1 billion stands, what are some near-term, maybe mid-term strategies to help take us the further 6%? What are some sort of things that you're really excited about that are sort of, oh, this is going to be impactful?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So as part of our Pathway 1, which is regional planning, that sort of has to be the start sometimes, right? If you don't have a plan in place, we wanted to make sure that there was money there to be able to kind of help people get plans in place. Or for those who already have plans, how can they be implemented? So there's 30 million specifically for regional planning. It's CFW's Natural Conservation Community program, I believe NCCP, that's what it stands for. And that's really to kind of jumpstart that, which is a key priority. But there's also our conservancies have a lot of money, as well as the Wildlife Conservation Board, for people who are ready for acquisition, who are ready for easements. So I think there's just a lot of excitement because it was an unprecedented amount of money that we could sort of quickly get started, which is great. Personally, I'm excited that there was a little bit of money in the budget to kind of continue to update our Explore applications. Data goes bad fast, right? It's quickly out of date. And so making sure that, we can kind of keep up to date with the latest available and best available science is important, or else these applications are kind of not useful anymore, right? So I think there's a lot to be excited about. But definitely more work to do, right? A lot of this is jump starting it, but we need to be thinking about how are we going to manage our lands, right? And so there's a lot more work to do there as we're kind of moving forward. So lots to be hopeful about, but I also recognize there's a lot we have to work on too.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. And a lot of our audience members are part of the UC Davis community. And so maybe the question that I have here is, what sort of role do you expect, or would you like researchers, university academics to play, maybe in partnership with the CNRA? And what's your experience with working with university-based researchers? What role can we play, maybe to help out or participate or be intermediary between the agency and communities? What's that vision from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of our work engaged with researchers has been through the California Biodiversity Network, and this is again a coalition of scientists that have come together. But that's not our only avenue, right? There's so many researchers in the state, and not everybody can sort of give their time to this coalition, or maybe kind of fits into one of their roundtables. So with them, it's been really helpful to get the information on what are going to be the science priorities. But again, that's not the only avenue. So we only have now 7 years, right? So that's not a lot of time for a lot of you to start a project today and have it finished with results and answers by 2030. So I think it's really important, to help us make decisions with the information that we have available now, while also pushing, right, for that better answer moving forward. So a little bit of help interpreting that, right? Like what is there now? How can we make a decision now? But how can we sort of invest in making it better in the future? That's always really helpful. Sometimes I have a week to make a decision, right? And that's definitely not enough time for a scientific study. So the more we know, the more communications we're getting. Venues like this, where people can kind of come together, ask questions, or I can learn about other topics, are really important to really help synthesize that so that we can be ready to make decisions as quickly as possible. But I don't want to get away from the fact that there's still so much more that we need to learn. So, there is a lot of research money going into the fifth climate assessment, some of that biodiversity focused. And so that will be really helpful, not only for updating our explorers, but also for thinking about how we implement our pathways. That's sort of like a focused research topic for us. But again, reaching out to us, if you have a paper, if you have a project you're working on, that is going to be useful to our initiatives, don't be shy, because we want to hear about it and it's really helpful to us. So really, again, facilitating that connection. There's a lot out there, and it's not always on our radar, unfortunately.
And Madeline, you mentioned the climate assessment, the state climate assessment. I did, some of us may have seen this morning, we were talking about before the webinar, Madeline, also, some of us may have seen the announcement this morning, I think from the governor's office, about the key priorities, that the research priorities for the national assessment, the state climate assessment. And we were talking about nature-based solutions, how that shows up numerous times. And I think the Natural Resource Agency is a steering committee of some, it's one of the lead agencies for it. What's your vision for how the climate assessment will tackle something like nature-based solutions? What's the vision there? How does coordinating that and realizing that vision look like? And just, I guess, what does that mean from the agency's perspective? What does nature-based solutions mean, and what do they look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have a very specific definition in our document, and I don't want to mess it up. So, I would encourage you to kind of go look at what that specific definition is in our document. But, don't quote me here, right? Because I don't want to, say that definition is the standing definition, but it's generally how can we use nature to combat climate change, and that's really important. Solar energy is, how a good way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, or wind energy, or there's like all these different energy things you can do, and there's also different changes that people in the community can make, like driving electric cars, or having more efficient houses. Right? There's so many facets of dealing with the climate issue. And we're really focused on, okay, how can we protect nature to help with that issue, right? So where are there places where it's sequestering more carbon, or where there are sort of important climate refugia for species, because we know that sort of diversity of species is important for healthy communities and ecosystems. So we're thinking about those pieces in particular, and how can research, how can we efficiently plan, right? So it's not just about getting as much nature as we can, but where does it make sense to put a solar facility or a wind facility so that we can meet those carbon goals, but we can also best protect biodiversity. So it's a couple things. It's, where are the places that are most important, and then how can we plan so that we can meet all those goals? So I hope that there's research that will inform that. I hope there's new data that will inform that. So that, the areas that we're protecting for 30 by 30 are the ones that are going to be most meaningful in helping us combat climate change and helping us preserve or protect our biodiversity.
Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Great. So we just have a couple more minutes left. Maybe I'll send out a last call for questions or comments. Let's wait for 20, 30 seconds here in case folks have something they want to bring up. Great. All right. If there's nothing immediate, I hope it's okay, Madeline, if folks reach out, maybe not to you directly, but to the agency, definitely. If things come to mind, I'm sure there's a ton of stuff that we can share. And I think there's a lot of common research and sort of practical interests that there's intersections there. So I hope that's okay. And we'll share the materials. And with that, maybe to thank you again for joining us this morning. It's wonderful to have you. I mean, from the number of questions that I was asking, maybe apologies for dominating the conversation a little bit, but I just found this really, really fascinating and really appreciative of the agency's work. And I think it's just really exciting. What's going on and what's going to happen. And so thank you again for sharing your insights and especially for doing this somewhat last minute, but I really appreciate your joining us. And as we close the session, just for those of you who are still here, reminder of our socials here. Sophia's put up, please do keep updated with our webinar series. We have a long list of really exciting talks coming up, including not quite next week, I think the week after, we have a representative from IBM Research talking about climate sustainability research from the private sector side, as typically a university-based setting that not often represented, funnily enough.